Hello, we are Rachel and Michael Aubrey. We represent a new initiative in SIL translation resources, biblical language research. Our purpose today is twofold. 1. Critically examine how existing biblical language grammars serve Bible translation. And 2. Introduce how biblical language research can serve the Bible translation community.
In Tom Payne's contribution to Perspectives on Grammar Writing, edited by himself and David Weber, he emphasizes that a grammar is not objective, but instead is a communicative act that is performed and interpreted in a context. We take his words as axiomatic for our efforts on the biblical languages. Such contexts may realize different types of grammars, such as grammars for instruction versus grammars for reference, teaching grammars for classrooms versus grammars for self-directed learning, grammars for native speakers versus grammars for the international community. And here we might also add biblical language grammars written for English speakers versus grammars for Bible translation.
When it comes to biblical language grammars, we're afraid that communication breaks down.
Grammars of biblical languages, whether reference or pedagogical, are also communicative acts, but their intended audiences are not minority language Bible translators, consultants, or linguists. Most existing biblical language grammars are in English. They are also grammars for English speakers. These are not grammars for Bible translation. This plays out in 3 ways. 1. These grammars use the jargon of the English grammar tradition. 2. They prioritize formal structure over functional description. And 3. They prioritize simple glosses in a way that obscures answers to questions that Bible translators ask.
First, we consider jargon. A grammar's communicative effectiveness will be derived from the interaction of the information presented and the context available to the audience. Let's examine that context.
When we say jargon, we're talking about terminology for explaining form-to-form mappings between Hebrew and Greek constructions and English ones. Mappings that lead professors to say things like, "My students have to learn English grammar before they can learn Greek or Hebrew grammar." Mounce's popular Basics of Biblical Greek is representative of the grammar tradition, and this is not specifically about him or his work. His introduction states his focus, to explain Greek grammar in terms of English grammar, with an emphasis on the similarities. Further on, he laments that many students simply do not know enough English grammar to learn Greek grammar. And most tellingly, he criticizes sentences like, "the teacher is me," over his preferred, "the teacher is I," confusing formal style with grammaticality. This is not only Greek grammar for English grammar, but specifically prescriptive English grammar. Recall Payne's words about communicative context. When grammar writers are lamenting their students' knowledge in their own grammars, we already have a communication problem. This problem is multiplied in a global context, even in nations where English functions as a language of wider communication. Teaching Greek from Mounce in the context of global language diversity produces substantial challenges. Effectively, all biblical language grammars, reference, and teaching struggle with this in some way. The language of description sets the tone for the contents.
Let's look at the jargon of aspect in Greek. Mounce says, "The aorist indicates a perfective action, usually occurring in the past. For now, it should be translated with the simple, undefined past tense in English." Similarly, Kostenberger, Merkel, and Plummer say, "The aorist tense form, that is, perfective aspect, is used when the author wants to portray the action in its entirety or as a whole." And finally, Porter, Reed, and O'Donnell state, "Perfective aspect views the action of the verb as a complete whole. The speaker or writer expresses this aspect by selecting the aorist tense form."
We end up with confusing results like this. The aorist stem is a tense form, which means perfective aspect, and that means view the event as a whole. Also, it's a past tense, except when it isn't. So we have contemporary teaching grammars saying tense form equals aorist indicative equals perfective past indicative, or tense form equals aorist infinitive equals perfective infinitive, wherein a linguist would simply say past perfective indicative or perfective infinitive. The grammar tradition wants to incorporate aspect research while also maintaining all of the traditional terminology they already use. This has resulted in terminological bloat, adding more and more terms for students to learn that defer the meaning of a form down a chain of more and more confusing terminology. This isn't helpful for English-speaking students, much less for Bible translation teams.
Let's consider one grammatical category in detail to illustrate these issues in English grammars. Grammatical voice. Biblical language grammars primarily view and describe the Greek and Hebrew voice systems through the lens of the English active-passive alternation. This English lens, through which Greek and Hebrew are described, is not only detrimental to our understanding of the functions of voice in the biblical languages, but it also hinders our ability to understand how Greek and Hebrew fit into the larger typological context of Bible translation.
Again, Mounce's grammar represents an illustrative example for the whole tradition. And here Mounce contrasts two English clauses to explain the difference between active and passive. I hit the ball. I am hit by the ball.
But notice what happens when he turns to the middle voice, especially as we've highlighted in bold. Translate most middles as if they were actives. The essence of the middle voice is that the subject is affected by the action. Many times, the subject affectedness will be so slight that it can hardly be felt. Mounce's account of English voice immediately transitions, with little comment about voice generally, to the Greek middle voice, and because English grammar is no longer available for reference, his explanation grows vague and unhelpful.
Let's break this down. The existing grammar tradition has adopted 3 steps for explaining Greek voice. 1. The grammar of the English voice system is presented in brief with little discussion of the syntactic and semantic issues that play a role in English voice alternations. 2. The Greek middle is framed in terms of how it should be translated into English. Greek middles are not significant because they can in most cases be translated with English actives. Note that English active glosses are of little import for understanding Greek relative to other languages. And 3, to the extent that Mounce comments on what the Greek middle voice actually means, he only presents an overly simplistic generalization of the kind Kemmer warned us about 30 years ago.
Here's Kemmer's warning. Subject affectedness covers too broad an area to be useful, while also being too limited as a definition because it refers to only a single property of the middle voice.
This definition for the middle, subject effectiveness, is relatively new. Previously, Mounce's 3rd edition presented middle voice as a discrete set of unrelated categories or usages, but now in the 4th edition, the middle is framed by the overly generalized definition of subject affectedness.
Rachel Aubrey, 2020, that's me, warns that both these strategies involve the same fundamental problem. By giving primacy to the active-passive alternation and its morphosyntactic expression, grammars are left with accounts of the middle that swing in wildly divergent directions. They're either all the variety and no coherence, or they rely on overly simple generalizations. Each approach, in its own way, construes voice functions too narrowly.
And this is a systemic issue. It's not just Mounce. The same critique could be made of Decker 2014, or Muraoka 2016, Whitaker 2019, von Siebenthal 2019. We can set aside the descriptive value or accuracy of this approach for a moment, and instead, let's focus on the implications for Bible translation. This approach is Anglo or Western-centric. It orients Greek language learning around the English-speaking Western pastor. In turn, it creates a barrier to any national translators as well as translation consultants from the global South.
There are, of course, a whole variety of other voice systems in the languages of the world. What is never discussed is how the voice systems of Greek and Hebrew compare or contrast to the voice systems of languages other than English. As a result, Bible translation teams may not know that they have the same or different voice systems as Greek or Hebrew. When an active, passive, or middle is expressed in the Greek New Testament, translation teams are not necessarily given the information they need to know the function of each of these clauses and how meaning may be expressed in a similar or different way in their own languages. In the absence of this critical information, translators may rely on a literal rendering of whatever structure occurs in the source text, despite whether those structures may or may not be appropriate in a given context. This attempt to reproduce the form shapes their translation choices, which may lead to misunderstandings or mistranslations.
Voice, valency, and transitivity represent a diverse set of grammatical structures. In addition to active-passive systems, languages might have antipassive systems, inverse systems, symmetrical systems, middle systems like Greek, or some combination or no voice system at all.
Even with passives, there are a diverse set of functions, such as the adversive passives in Malay and Vietnamese. Of course, some languages have no passive at all. What these different examples illustrate is that in the voice system of each language, the passive functions within and alternates with different structures and different meanings in their respective languages. The passive in the receptor language is not like the English passive because the passive might be participating in a wide set of different voice alignments and alternations. The excessive attention to a specific passive structure for delineating and solving translation problems has forced consultants and translation teams to unwittingly focus upon form-form equivalencies instead of meaning equivalencies.
The problems of conflict between voice systems across source, mediating, and receptor languages are, of course, well known. But the Bible translation community has trended toward a sort of ad hoc and just-in-time patchwork of solutions for such translation problems. The grammatical structure of biblical languages has historically been reduced to a set of discrete translation problems, rather than the systematic and structured grammar of real languages, spoken by real people in a time and place. This is not a judgment of the past. The Bible translation community has always had to deal with constraints on training, resources, and needs, and just-in-time advice like this has helped millions of people receive Bibles in their languages. These are nevertheless accurate facts about the translation process and approaches to translation resources. We can only judge how we will move forward.
Any grammar that only discusses Greek in terms of the English active-passive system is not a grammar that is maximally useful or accessible for translation. Biblical language grammar resources for Bible translation must be contextualized for a broader set of target languages.
We've just considered the accessibility of Greek and Hebrew grammars in terms of the category of voice. Let us now turn to our example of relevance, prepositions. Andreas Joswig recently observed, some grammatical features will automatically be applied correctly by translators, while other features of the target language force choices on the translators. It is this second kind of feature that translation consultants need to pay attention to, because what may sound like a correct grammatical expression can indeed be the wrong choice, leading to unnatural language or semantic misrepresentations. Among the grammatical categories that he highlighted that needed to be checked closely are prepositions and their semantics. Greek and Hebrew both convey spatial, temporal, and abstract relational meanings with prepositions. Yet not all of the world's languages use prepositions for such relationships. This represents a direct and practical need in translation resources, consulting, and language documentation.
If you open a standard lexicon or reference grammar for Greek or Hebrew prepositions, you're likely to find these function words defined by a list of English glosses, with a few examples paired with each gloss. Grammars often rely on a spatial chart to do the work, without reference to metaphorical extensions to abstract domains, much less any syntactic information.
Lexicons provide a broad range of meanings for a single preposition, but because a pattern might be affected by the combination with other elements, it is not always clear under which conditions a specific significance is applicable. Senses come across as unconnected. The length of the list conceals semantic patterns. Question: how do you know when you're supposed to interpret the preposition "and" to mean "with the help of" in sense 6? The temptation is great for exegetes or translators to take the liberty of choosing from the offered glosses, apparently not being sufficiently aware in the moment that elements present in the context could pose restrictions upon the choice of rendering for any given preposition.
Prepositions and postpositions are famously polysemous, as we can see from this semantic map, with examples from English, Japanese, Dutch, Berber, and Spanish. The reality is that these forms from one language are not coextensive with those in another language. This can lead to confusion and to collocational clashes in attempted renderings from source to target language. Moreover, these are only spatial senses. What about extensions from space to other domains? How does a preposition that I learned means under also mean causation or instigation of an action?
When we go beyond prepositions, receptor languages introduce a variety of other challenges. Prepositions are just one formal strategy for marking space, time, and other abstract relations. In Una, an instrumental postposition can be replaced by a verb and an object. Where Greek and Hebrew use a preposition, Una might use a complex clause. Tuwali Ifagao employs multiple strategies for spatial and abstract relations. There are 5 verb classes for spatial relations, plus derivational morphology can express causation, containership, or parts of wholes. Where Greek and Hebrew use a preposition, Tuwali Ifagao employs verb roots and affixes. The arbitrary list of senses presented in grammars and dictionaries are not equipped for helping consultants and translators engage with the source languages in conjunction with this type of linguistic diversity.
These examples can be multiplied across numerous grammatical structures, such as genitive constructions, gender and classifier systems, tense aspect and modality systems, evidentiality, conditionality, participles and relative clauses, pronominal reference, and so many more.
Linguists in Bible translation have made significant contributions to our knowledge of biblical languages, particularly in lexical semantics and discourse. But what about the middle? We have historically deferred to biblical studies for grammar proper, even though biblical studies simply does not have the linguistic capacity to engage with the biblical languages in ways that are practical and effective for Bible translation in minority and indigenous languages, because English and Western-centric grammars add barriers and increase the cost of entry for learning the languages and the language structure. They have effectively already failed. These grammars burden consultants with source-receptor translation problems they cannot foresee. We end up juggling multiple meta-languages from multiple source language grammars in a way that adds unnecessary work and processing for both consultants and translators.
This is why we want to make grammar resources that 1. Answer the questions translators ask. 2. Use terminology that ordinary working linguists already know. 3. Place the biblical languages into a larger typological context. And 4. Support the ongoing growth of communicative language learning with grammar resources, uninhibited by Western languages.
We want to create lasting change for biblical language description. Linguists know that language data cannot explain itself. The examples in a grammar are only as useful as the prose that explains them. So biblical language datasets are just not enough alone. Full, accessible, and clear documentation is also needed. We want to write textbooks and curricula that ground biblical languages in the same methods of existing grammatical analysis courses. We want to help invigorate linguistics education by reinforcing linguistics training in and through biblical language instruction. Better engagement in linguistics for source languages means better engagement in linguistics for everyone. And similarly, we want to write reference grammars that prioritize function and leverage insights from foreign language reference grammars.
A functional approach to biblical language description can provide a more effective means of making knowledge of Greek and Hebrew more accessible, and in turn better empower translation teams and consultants to effectively engage with Greek and Hebrew in ways that directly relate to their receptor languages.